I didn't quite know really what to do, particularly in 10 minutes, and it's this whole issue, it seems to me, about what kind of station interchange and where it actually is. We do get many examples, don't we, of the station and the city being one and the same, usually in large cities. Here we see the Gare du Nord, and you're straight out of it, and you're into fantastically diverse, robust fabric straight away, because the stations came straight in, they compete to get as far as they possibly can, as they did in London, and then they hit something precious, and they're not allowed to go any further, having wiped out places where poor people live. And the thing that is therefore, to me, fascinating, and it was great, I concur with everything that Andy said, but am I the only person who's allowed to be staggeringly underwhelmed by a lot of King's Cross? Because I really am, and not so much the adaptation of some of the existing stuff, but the new stuff that has come in. Seems to me it could be just about anywhere, despite all the remarkable efforts carried out by Argent. It could be a business park in Colorado, as far as I'm concerned. You know, I mean, I think there are great disappointments there, notwithstanding the extraordinary complex thing that Argent have done. So it might sound churlish to be disappointed by something like that, but I'm afraid I really am, you know, around this lot. Don't know what the hell it really is, in truth. But it raises the issue, doesn't it, about stations and their positions, what they're trying to become. Because when we look at King's Cross, you go into or particularly St Pancras, I suppose. You go into St Pancras and you're staggered by the volume and the space and the nature of it. It is quite absolutely extraordinary. But if I'm being a little cynical, is it railway station a shopping mall? In the sense that the amount of stuff that Network Rail captures and puts inside that ought to be outside, it seems to me to be, it's a shopping mall. And the big issue that's coming now with Temple Temple Meads in Bristol is the fact that the extent to which Network Rail are working on something in splendid isolation to capture as much of it as they possibly can, put it inside their own concourse and let the devil take the hindmost. And we're finding that an enormous amount. So clearly there's a massive issue here about how far you have to go and why you have to go far in order to make a station become something more than just a station. And I don't think there's anything like enough thought going into that, other than filling them full of Costa coffees and fat faces and all sorts of other stuff while you wait for your train. And I feel that's a great disappointment. Clearly, we know that land speculation was first and foremost in a hell of a lot of railways. Nothing to do with taking people to where they wanted to go. It was taking to people where you would make money out of putting them there. And that was, and in the USA and everywhere else, Scarsdale, all these places produced, in fact, some very, very nice locations that grew around the station. And that seems to me to be one of the big issues that we're facing right now, if we are going to believe in rail travel and light rail travel as being an agent of growth and a rationale for growth. I was staggered, quite frankly, by the City of Anglia. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but it's it's called the City of Anglia, and in fact it's a series of smaller places strung along a railway line. And that is a major issue about the role of stations and trains and movement, because, as I said at the time, you know, it's sort of, shit, I've run out of milk, I'd better get the 6.15, you know, because I can't buy a bottle of milk here because it ain't big enough. Or, you know, that whole issue about calling something a city and stringing it all the way along is a massive issue. And this was a very serious proposition. You'll find it in a lot of the transit-oriented development stuff in the USA. If you're going to do this, the question is, what on earth are these? You know, they have to be something of substance. They have to be something that is not relying on the railway line, and because if not, it's a place where it's just a place to leave as opposed to a place to stay. And I think there's a fundamental issue again, if we're going to do much more in the world as a whole, I feel like, rail-related growth. I've worked a lot of things on a lot of things in Australia over the years, and Perth, as you know, is sprawl hell. But growing like crazy, it's a very good climate, it's a very popular place to be. But the whole issue of whether, when we were working on this with all sorts of other brilliant specialists, the question was, if it was a heavy rail-based growth, and therefore very few stations, the whole issue of making the heavy rail work as opposed to light rail growth, which meant you could stop much more frequently, the whole structure of the urbanism changed if it was a light rail growth strategy as opposed to a heavy rail growth strategy. And you still had to make all the, all the necessary environmental stroke ecological things you have to do. So the thing that was fascinating about it was the difference in the growth of the urbanism if it was heavy rail based or light rail based. And the thing that grieves me, I suppose, and this is back as 1995, if you look, this is light rail systems. The fact that if we are talking about stations and environmental responsibility and so on, in the USA, the number of light rail systems that are leading growth rather than following it puts the rest of us and Europe and other places to shame, quite frankly. And it grieves me to say it. When you look at Orenco Station, quite a ways out of Portland, but there's the light rail line, and you can see that as a result of the impact this thing has had, it's almost beyond punching way above its weight. There's something about the light rail that makes people want to and invest in a form of consolidation that they would never have done if the damn thing hadn't been there. Even if they don't actually use it in a certain way, or they don't use it very, very much. And Orenco Station is extraordinary when you look at what's immediately resulting from the presence of a tram. And you know as well as I do, if we were out in the boonies on the edge of Portland, that wouldn't be at all like that if it wasn't for this. And it's an extraordinary way in which that sort of stuff leads. This is in Pasadena. And look at the development around these things as we know. Of course, with here in the company of the splendid Space Syntax, I suppose there's talking about teaching people to suck eggs, but the idea of the fact when you look at the role of the railway station and the fabric around it and see how this performs, I didn't have the figures, but how badly this one performs as opposed to this one, and then you look at the comparison of, for example, the difference in percentages of four-way intersections. There's 29 in this little area, there's 8 in this one. Cul-de-sacs, there are 5 in this, there are 31 in that. There's a 520% difference. Just the whole way in which the station isn't going to work unless we get the rest of the urban fabric sorted out in the first place. Bob Severo has done a lot of work on this, as I'm sure many of you know, but very interesting things in the context of the USA, that 300 feet from a railway station, 63% of residents in Washington used the railway who lived that distance. About 40%, and a whole series of statistics that are to do with distance and use and walkability. Seemingly, the average distance a New Yorker walks from Transit to work is 1,380 feet. In Washington, D.C., it's a lot less. And that must be to do with the fabric, unless the people in Washington, D.C. are some kind of different sort of creature from the people in New York, or it's the actual urban fabric that encourages it, that induces it, that invites it, that makes you feel comfortable whilst you're doing it. Of course, this Clarence Perry diagram, as I've called the worst diagram in the history of planning, but if we look at a sort of a simple diagram of a traditional piece of urbanism where you center at the 100% corner, as it were, and you grow around there, which is how cities have grown, perhaps cross-culturally for many, many years, and then you can see how transit can work in association with that. You actually take Clarence Perry's stupid diagram of actually shifting the centre for local people away from the logical spatial centre, and that means that everything runs around the outside. Every British new town is damn near like that, and we've lived with it for many years in a very, very dysfunctional fashion. It's evolved and it's grown, and it gets to this now, where you suddenly see here's the centre of the neighbourhood, presumably, the walkable distance, here we go, a 10-minute walk or whatever you want to allow for, and lo and behold, the transit corridor is down the edge. It's round the edge here. And there's a total disconnect between the things running through the centre as they would have done in a traditional piece of urbanism. So the way in which we structure the urbanism seems to me to be pretty fundamental. One of the things that worked with Space Syntax on some years ago was a massive extension to Harlow. Here's Harlow town centre. You can see the dead worms all over the place, and the internal neighbourhoods that don't support a damn thing. And the proposition that came out of the work with syntax up here, very simplistically drawn, but totally different in kind. Now, as you know, one of the biggest issues we have with railway stations, those that are on the edge, is that if we're trying to make them work, and particularly because they run along river valleys, obviously, pretty much, and therefore they're in areas that you can't build anything on, the whole dilemma of what a railway station can be as a centre depends obviously on where it sits in the overall fabric. In London as a world city, that's not particularly an issue, but in lots of other towns it's a massive issue, because we were looking at how the public transport would work. It would all go across a crossing by the railway station, but how difficult it is, even though it's in the middle of the town now, to make the station an alive and vibrant place because of floodplains, because of all sorts of other stuff. So there are massive conflicts right now, and working with space syntax, as you can see on all of this, of course, all the roads that would have all the normal mixed use were the dead grid roads with nothing on them, of course. And what do you get as a new building? Something that's sort of fallen from the sky and landed in the middle of the thing here, which, if this is how we're going to respond to intensifying railway stations in order that people can get into London quickly, then heaven help us, because this is one of the most appalling things you'll ever see in terms of a response to making some kind of centre around a station. And clearly, if trains are going to get faster, not necessarily going to get cheaper, but if they're going to get faster, then a lot of smaller stations now I've got an enormous amount of issues to face. If we're starting to be able to commute further and further and further and further, then how do these stations relate to the centres of the towns that they're in if the station is on the edge? There's a potential tension, I think, between building something around the station and killing the thing that is there already, unless you get an incredible piece of connectivity. So the idea of growing stations, particularly if Network Rail try to internalise them all the time and capture all the commercial goodies, then there's a real risk, I think, of us, with, the wrong intention. Finally, I think, Didcot. We worked on this a lot with Tim and Bill and the team. Fantastic, as Andy said, to work with them on this, because this was a massive project that where the government are attempting to try and turn this whole area into kind of one of our equivalents of Silicon Valley, because you've got Harwell down here, which has got all sorts of scientific gizmos in it. You've got Milton Park, and you've got Culham, and you've got sort of the crossroads of the railway line that Brunel always identified. Of course, the old line to Southampton is disused, but Brunel saw this as being the crossroads of Britain in terms of rail. And if you think of how, I don't think any town could underachieve more than Didcot manages to do in that context. No disrespect to Didcot, because it's never known what it is, and it's never been allowed to become what it should be, and it's an extraordinary kind of mishmash of stuff, as you know, and because it's a relatively low value in this part of the world, then obviously the usual suspects, the box bashers, are all over this thing, and building the usual stuff of just throttling the movement system with their usual layout of cul-de-sac and what have you. So we were looking to try, well, there it is. You see Didcot Station, and of course the trains that head to the north here go straight past. So that was a spanner in Brunel's works, which he never particularly intended, in the sense I don't know of any railway station that has a bypass of trains that actually mean that nothing stops, apart from the little ones that toddle off to Oxford. They stop, but the ones that heading up further north quicker don't actually stop here, they go herring past. So the combination of those things, and bearing in mind if this area is going to succeed in terms of capturing the incredible amount of investment that's necessary for things, there's some amazing pieces of kit down here buried in Harwell. And you know as well as I do that people who are going to invest in a lot of high-tech stuff can be relatively footloose today. They can kind of go into various places, and the environment in which their workers live is incredibly important to them. So a lot of work was done there on that. And the idea of getting from the station, from Heathrow to here for a start, and the idea is, as I understand it, that in longer term plans you can, if Heathrow stays where it is, you can get off a train, you will have to get on a train at Heathrow and come to Didcot, where we, in the fullness of time, heaven knows, we talked about 70 years for... But you can come to Didcot and then go to the Science Vale area. So that involved us, again, a classic example here, I think, of a real conundrum, no question, is if you develop around this station, clearly it's very difficult for stations, particularly in this situation, to behave like centres with two sides because of the massive division that is brought about. Now, we know in smaller stations, even if it's just two lines, you can't cross at grade anymore, right? You have to be grade separated. And that makes a whole difference, to my mind, to the nature of a station and the space. If you have to take an enormous bridge to get you the headroom over the train, then how far back does it go? And there's all sorts of detailed things. But another big issue here in Didcot, I think, was that if you do start to say, well, there's going to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people coming and getting off here, none of which go to Didcot Centre anymore, I mean, if they ever did. And so do you create a centre here that shifts the actual high street down here that is in fact much better integrated in the growth of Didcot than this actually is, but this gets the people. And so how do you reconcile that in the actual redevelopment of the place? A really complex set of issues. So to make a double-sided station on here, and therefore this train could stop and you could come underneath, a massive thing. And this, of course, is again this whole issue of the different people not talking to each other. This, not surprisingly from Network Rail's point of view, is about 12th on a list of 10 things in terms of stations that they're going to invest in, because they're not party to the other ideas about what it wants to be in terms of a science base for industry and innovation. So you've got on the one hand the transport system is not talking to UK PLC who are wanting to build something around here, and therefore it's not a priority in their spending. And as you know, they're also raising their bridges for electrification, but they're not reinforcing, as I understand it, they're not reinforcing the bridges so you can, or widening them so you can cross them with more traffic. That's somebody else's job. You know, so you get incredible disconnections between things. Cut. I've finished. Thank you.